The long game that only worked once. For a long time, it looked unimpressive, almost outdated, like a strategy borrowed from a slower era and stubbornly applied to a world that no longer had patience for it. While others moved quickly, adapted constantly, and chased every emerging signal, this approach stayed fixed, deliberate, and largely ignored, dismissed as cautious to the point of irrelevance. Few believed it could still work, and even fewer believed it was intentional. This story matters now because modern success is often framed as repeatable, scalable, and endlessly optimizable. We are taught that a strategy works once. It can be systematized, refined, and deployed again under similar conditions. But history shows a harsher truth. Some advantages exist only within a narrow window, dependent on timing, context, and collective behavior that can never be recreated once it has passed. The long game in this story was not about patience alone. It was about committing to an outcome so far in the future that most competitors refused to believe it was the real objective. While others optimized for quarterly results, market sentiment, and rapid feedback, one player accepted years of underperformance, criticism, and doubt in exchange for positioning that would only make sense at the end. At the time, the trade-offs looked irrational. Capital sat idle longer than expected. Opportunities were declined without explanation. Growth was sacrificed for alignment. Observers interpreted these choices as conservatism or fear, because the payoff was too distant to measure and too abstract to defend. What made the strategy viable was not conviction alone. It was context. The market was fragmented. Standards were unsettled. No dominant structure yet existed. That uncertainty allowed a long game to unfold quietly, because no one could be sure which direction would ultimately matter. But this condition was temporary. As industries mature, options collapse. Standards harden. Late advantages disappear. The long game only works before that happens. And while it was unfolding, almost no one realized they were watching something that could never be repeated again. Because by the time the outcome became visible, the conditions that made it possible were already gone. As the years passed, the long game continued to test everyone's patience, including those closest to it, because progress remained difficult to measure and success refused to arrive on any conventional timeline. Competitors surged ahead in visible ways, capturing attention, capital, and confidence, while the long-term strategy appeared increasingly isolated, anchored to assumptions that many believed the market would eventually disprove. What kept the strategy alive was not momentum, but coherence. Every decision, even the ones that looked passive or regressive, aligned with the same distant objective. There were no reactive pivots, no attempts to chase short-term validation, no compromises made to satisfy external pressure. This consistency created an internal logic that outsiders struggled to see, but insiders relied on to justify continued restraint. Meanwhile, the market began to consolidate in predictable ways. Early leaders emerged. Standards started forming. Networks strengthened around dominant players who had optimized for speed and scale. To most observers, this looked like confirmation that the long game had failed. The window for disruption appeared to be closing, but that interpretation missed something critical. As consolidation increased, flexibility vanished. Early winners became locked into their own success, bound by infrastructures, partnerships, and narratives that limited their ability to adapt when conditions shifted. Their dominance was real, but it was also rigid. The long game depended on that rigidity. It required others to commit early, to choose sides, to define the market in ways that could later be leveraged against them. While competitors celebrated stability, the long-term strategy waited for saturation, knowing that once growth slowed, structure would matter more than speed. This waiting period was uncomfortable and expensive. Doubt intensified. Criticism sharpened. Opportunities passed by that, in isolation, would have been profitable. But accepting those gains would have broken alignment with the eventual objective. By the time the industry reached maturity, the difference between strategies was no longer subtle. One side had optimized the present. The other had positioned itself for a future that could only exist once expansion ended. And as that future approached, the long game moved from improbable to inevitable. The conflict emerged when the market finally reached the stage the long game had been waiting for, the moment when growth slowed enough that structure, governance, and positioning mattered more than speed or visibility. What had once been an advantage for early movers now became a constraint. as their scale locked them into systems that were difficult to change without destabilizing everything they had already built. Competitors began to feel pressure from directions they had not anticipated. Margins tightened as expansion opportunities diminished. Innovation slowed under the weight of coordination. Every adjustment required negotiation across layers of infrastructure that had been optimized for growth, not flexibility. The same decisions that had fueled dominance now resisted adaptation. This was where the long game revealed its true shape, because it had avoided premature commitments. It retained the ability to move when others could not. While competitors were defending their positions, the long-term strategy entered spaces they could no longer access without conflict or loss. What looked like patience earlier now functioned as leverage. The emotional tension inside the industry became palpable. Early winners sensed that their advantage was eroding, but reversing course felt impossible. Their success had hardened into obligation. They were maintaining systems rather than choosing direction, protecting legacy positions rather than shaping the future. By contrast, the long game faced no such burden. It was not protecting scale. It was activating positioning. Moves that would have been risky years earlier now landed cleanly, because the market had already eliminated alternatives through consolidation. Choice had narrowed for everyone else. Attempts to respond exposed the asymmetry. Restructuring was slow. Exits were expensive. New strategies conflicted with old commitments. The early leaders were trapped by coherence they could not break without admitting vulnerability. The conflict was no longer competitive in the traditional sense. It was structural. One side still had freedom of movement. The other was bound by decisions made under conditions that no longer existed. This was the moment the long game stopped being questioned and started being feared. The climax arrived not as a sudden victory, but as a realization that resistance was no longer possible, because the long game had aligned perfectly with a market that could no longer move the way it once did. What competitors felt in that moment was not surprise, but quiet recognition that the conditions now favored only one path forward. It was not the one built on speed, scale, or early dominance. The long game worked because it waited for saturation. It waited for standards to harden. It waited for flexibility to disappear everywhere else. By the time it moved decisively, the market had already eliminated alternatives through its own evolution. There was nothing left to compete against, only structures to step into. Those who had expanded early found themselves managing decline rather than shaping direction. Their systems were efficient but inflexible. Their dominance was real but brittle. Every attempt to adjust required concessions that weakened their position further. The future arrived, and they were not positioned to meet it. What made this strategy impossible to repeat was timing. The conditions that allowed such patience no longer exist once a market matures. Information travels faster. Imitation happens instantly. Windows close quickly. The long game only works when others refuse to believe it is being played at all. This is the deeper lesson behind the story. Not every advantage is scalable. Not every success can be replicated. Some outcomes depend on a rare alignment of disbelief, fragmentation, and time, conditions that vanish the moment they are understood. History often treats victories like formulas, but some wins are singular. They happen once, under circumstances that cannot be reconstructed, no matter how well they are studied afterward. The long game did not succeed because it was patient. It succeeded because it was early in a world that did not yet realize how late it would become. And once that moment passed, the door closed behind it forever. The long